above average precipitation for much of the Mid-South into the southern Midwest.
Hi again, everybody. Welcome back to the CommStock Channel. I'm Marlin Bohling with you. Well, we love talking with you about ag-related issues, and today should be a great program. I have Trent Ford with me here, and he's the state climatologist for the state of Illinois. And you actually work out of what location? Are you in Champaign, or where are you?
Yeah, so I'm based at Water Survey, the Illinois State Water Survey, which is part of the U of I. So I'm here in Champaign.
Obviously, the topic today is going to be ag weather, and now that we're getting squarely into the start of planting season, this ought to be good because everybody wants to know, are we going to have fast or rapid planting progress this year, or are we going to have a hit and miss type scenario? Remember last year in the Northwestern Corn Belt, how wet it was and how much flooding we had. This year, I assume things are probably quite a bit different here, Trent. So give me a rundown on planning weather for the next week or two.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what, we have definitely, it seems like the Midwest, there's always a tale of two or three different places. And like you mentioned last year, the difference between what was a pretty timely, if not early, planting in the southern part of the Midwest compared to how wet it was up in the Northwest. And we've sort of flipped this year, where we have fairly good workable soils, at least from a moisture standpoint, in much of the northern western part of the Corn Belt, the Dakotas, parts of Nebraska, Iowa, and actually many of those places have been dealing with the legacy of drought that's gone back since last season. But of course, drought this year also means that those soils tend to be a bit more workable, whereas the southern and eastern parts of the Corn Belt have about a week and a half ago received anywhere between 2 inches and in some cases in parts of Kentucky 15 to 16 inches of rainfall that has at least made soils wet, if not lake-like, as far as standing water concerns. So, in the places where we see the earliest progress start being made as far as planting this time of the year in the southern Midwest, especially southeast Missouri and eastward into southern Illinois, western Kentucky. That's where, like you said, probably going to be a bit more hit or miss. The places that are a little bit better drained, maybe got 5 or 6 inches instead of 15 inches, may be able to get in with the dry weather that we've seen this week. Hopefully ahead of rains that are coming this weekend. As we move west and north, that's where even though it's still kind of early for those places where we are seeing a bit more dry conditions that can facilitate a bit more field work. So, and like here in central Illinois, going into central Indiana, we did get a lot of rain a week and a half ago, but the standing water, the flooded ditches have receded and actually right along the I-74 corridor between Champaign and Bloomington Normal. I was driving yesterday and I saw three planters out actually. So folks are trying to take advantage of the dry weather that we've been given this week ahead of rains this weekend. We'll see that activity. But like I said, in the place that we typically see at this time of the year in the southern part of the Corn Belt, it's still pretty wet, so it'll be a bit more hit or miss there.
Might be one of those years where you have to plant around the wet spots and then hopefully hit them later on.
That's exactly it. And, this is one thing is that the timing of that really heavy rain and then the rain that we're going to see this upcoming weekend, over Easter weekend, is early enough that hopefully we haven't seen a lot of folks get caught off guard and having the replant issues. I mean, there's a big difference between when we get heavy rain in the first week of April and the last week of April, right? Because by that time, we've seen these Aprils before where it's dry for the first 3 weeks. People are like, hey, let's get it in, we'll get it in, and then we turn cold and wet, and that's just it's just not where we want to be. So at the very least, if we're seeing folks getting staying out of the field for now in those really wet spots, at least it's a delayed planting situation and not a replant situation.
Speaking of which, can you address the soil temperatures here around the plains? A lot of people have been talking to me about the fact that they're so concerned about how cold the soil has been, especially in the upper Midwest. So what's the situation there? Where is that dividing line?
Yeah, so soil temperatures have been slow to come around, and I mentioned how dry it had been up in the northwest part of the Corn Belt, but despite that, and usually when we have a drier start to spring, especially how warm March was, we usually see those soil temperatures really jump up. But I think the issue is that we had a fairly cold winter. It was actually colder than normal for most of the region. And in that north part of the Midwest, we didn't have a ton of snowpack. And so that meant that that soil frost could really penetrate pretty deeply, which means that it takes a long time for those soils to come on. You know, the air temperature switches quickly as we move into spring, but those soils have a lag time, and that's kind of what we're seeing. So, like I mentioned, the earlier part where the soil moisture is conducive to field work in that northern part of the Midwest. The soil temperatures are still lagging quite a bit, and so that dividing line of, let's say, consistently having soil temperatures consistently above 50 degrees Fahrenheit is sort of right through the middle of the Midwest right now. So, just draw a line kind of from Kansas City across to Indianapolis. South of there, we're seeing soil temperatures that are consistently above 50 degrees. But north of there is still lagging behind kind of previous years where we've had pretty warm winters leading into warm springs. So when we look at the outlook, at least for the next the kind of 2 week outlook. So temperatures are going to be pretty moderate over the next week, but then the week two outlook, which takes us through the end of April, that's leaning warmer than normal for the entire, pretty much the entire Corn Belt. And then the week 3 to 4 outlook, as well as the longer term outlooks, are all leaning near to, if not warmer than normal. So, spring is variable. We may see a 2 3 day period here and there where our temperatures drop down below normal, but there isn't any kind of big, problematic cold spell that we see, at least in the near term, that could set those temperatures, soil temperatures, back even further. So hopefully we'll see those continue to climb to those places where it makes sense to get started on that planting.
Well, we mentioned last year we had the flooding in the western Corn Belt or the northwestern Corn Belt and dryness in the east, like along the Mid-Atlantic region last year. It sounds like maybe the script has been flipped this year. Is that kind of generally speaking fairly accurate?
Yeah, generally speaking, that's been the case where we've been a lot more active as far as storms and rainfall across the southern part of the Corn Belt. Just roughly from Joplin up to Columbus, Ohio. That Ohio Valley especially has just been inundated, and it was very wet there in the wintertime. We got a little bit of a break in March, and then we had that big rainfall a couple of weeks ago where most of the Ohio Valley picked up at least 4 to 5 inches of rain, if not more. Over the next 7 days, so going out to the week after Easter, over Easter weekend, it does look like that region from southeast or southwest Missouri, really all the way up to central Ohio, is again predicted to pick up anywhere between an inch and a half and in some cases up to 4 to 5 inches of rain. And that's falling on very wet soils. We have our sensors that monitor water table levels at a bunch of stations across the state of Illinois, and our one that's closest to St. Louis, it shows 0. So that water table is at the surface. And so what that means is that any rain that falls on the ground has absolutely nowhere to go. And so on some of the hillier areas, the few hills we have here in Illinois, it'll run off. But for that flat land, it's going to pond. And so we're likely going to see, some more kind of ponding water, standing water in some of those wetter fields, especially those that are poorly drained. So, across the fields that are tiled, it's probably going to move off fairly quickly. But again, in those places that were a little bit less well drained, we may see continued delays across that area. Whereas, when we get certainly north of Interstate 80, the not a whole lot of precipitation, certainly less than an inch is expected for the whole region there. So yeah, we've sort of flipped that script where, especially south of I-70 has been very, very wet. And in the kind of eastern half of the region, the northern regions have been a little bit drier. Not excessively dry by any means, but at least a little bit drier.
About a month and a half ago, this would have been after Oh, after we had all the flooding rains in eastern Kentucky, remember how they had all the flooding there around Pikeville, Kentucky, and in West Virginia at that time. And I happened to cross the Ohio River for a meeting heading north at Louisville or Owensboro, I guess. And I was amazed at that time when I went over the river how high the water was, and it was like I was on the Outer Banks. I had water on both sides of the road
Yeah.
on the Indiana side for 4 miles before I drove out of the water. And that was before we had all this heavy rainfall lately. I mean,
Yeah.
I can't imagine what that's like now. That's almost got to shut down the river transportation, doesn't it now?
Yeah, I just saw a picture from Owensboro that the river is expected to peak today on Wednesday, I believe, and it was very close to the walls that they had there, and you could definitely tell it was well above normal stream flow. And yeah, just looking at the maps today here, we have moderate to major flooding pretty much all along the Ohio from Evansville down to Cairo. That lower Ohio basin, especially when we get to where the Tennessee River drains, because they got so much rain in parts of kind of northwest Tennessee that draining through and parts of western Kentucky that drain through the Kentucky, and so just looking at that, the Ohio River there at Cairo is getting pretty close to cresting. It'll probably crest today on this Wednesday at about 53 feet, which would put it right about fifth or sixth highest there at Cairo, which that record goes back quite a ways, and the highest in many places since 2011, if we remember back to then how wet that, especially May to June was. And just to give you an idea, or like to back up your point about how high the river was, the Mississippi River had been, because of drought, and the headwaters had been fairly low coming into last week. And so between just about a 10-day period, the Mississippi there at Memphis jumped from 7 feet to 38 feet. So 31-foot change in 10 days, just showing how much water is draining through that basin. And so yeah, it's really incredible. I actually just to kind of put numbers in perspective, I did this back of the envelope calculation where the Ohio River Basin from Cairo, where it drains the Mississippi, all the way up to headwaters in Pittsburgh. The Ohio River Basin over that 4-day period in early April got about 56 million acre feet of water from precipitation. To put that in perspective, the entire Colorado River Basin, Lake Powell, Lake Mead, all of those reservoirs currently have about 25 million acre feet. So that means the Ohio River Basin got twice as much water in 4 days as we have for the entire storage across the Colorado River Basin. So just in a tremendous amount of water that fell across there, and we're seeing that now start to drain, and bringing up even those bigger rivers like the Ohio and the Mississippi.
I keep thinking back, gosh, just a few months ago. Remember how shipping by barge was so expensive because they could
Yeah.
only carry like half a load um, because of the low water levels. They couldn't carry much draft. Boy, how things have changed. I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you about, I just received the new ENSO update here a couple days ago from the Climate Prediction Center. And now it sounds like they're expecting what they call, quote unquote, normal conditions, whatever that means,
Yeah.
through the summer months here in the U.S. growing areas. I wanted to get your take on that. What do you think of that? What does that mean?
Yeah, so La Nina is officially dead. So that is something like they called time of death earlier this month. And so the thing is about La Nina, which we'd carried through the winter, and its partner El Nino, or its cousin, is that we only define La Nina and El Nino based on, generally speaking, ocean conditions. So sea surface temperatures and maybe some pressures thrown in there out in the Pacific. And so we can have a La Nina and El Nino that it's classified as one, but the atmosphere isn't responding to that. So the ocean has to influence the atmosphere, and the Pacific has to influence the position of the jet stream that gives us wetter, warmer, drier, cooler, whatever it may be, depending on where you are. And so this year, despite the fact that we barely eked out a La Nina, it was very weak. The atmosphere responded in a way that is very strongly consistent with a La Nina. It was dry in the south and southwest, wet along the Ohio Valley, very active spring severe weather so far in the Midwest. That's quintessential La Nina. So the fact that we've now officially gotten rid of the La Nina, we're out of La Nina pattern, does not mean that the atmosphere is going to stop responding in that way because there's some lag time. So even though that's the case, that we are now done with La Nina, when we look at the outlooks for the next month or so, we still see dry in the southwest, wet in the Ohio Valley, and an outlook that's expected to be continue to be very active when it comes to severe weather, especially in the southern half of the Midwest. All that being said, we do the forecasts are and all the outlooks are for a continuation of La Nina to or those sea surface temperature anomalies that characterize La Nina to continue to weaken. So we're in what they call neutral stage right now. So not La Nina, not El Nino, and it's the outlook is for us to stay in neutral stage at least through the fall. What's really interesting is that when we look at the latest outlooks from NOAA, there's actually still best chances for neutral and so neutral conditions through the fall, but we start to see a little bit more inkling of a return to La Nina in the fall and into the winter. So we'll have to see. It's not unheard of to go from La Nina kind of die off in the summer and then back to La Nina in winter. We actually a few years ago went through what they call a triple dip, where we go La Nina, La Nina, La Nina, 3 winters in a row. But it is interesting to see that, because if we go back to 2019, this year will have been, I think, the fifth La Nina, or maybe the fourth or fifth La Nina, whereas we've only had one El Nino winter over that time period. So we've definitely been a La Nina preference type of pattern. But yes, right now, I know this is a long answer to your relatively straightforward question, but yeah, we've been neutral. We're now in neutral stage. And again, expected to carry that forward at least through the summer, if not in the fall. What that means for us here at least in the Midwest and most of the U.S. is not really a whole lot for the summertime. Even if we still had La Nina in the summer, and the atmosphere responding to that, we don't see as strong of a pattern response as far as precipitation is concerned in the summertime. It just doesn't matter as much, and so what really matters is, how the rest of the spring shapes up, which, like I mentioned, the atmosphere is still kind of responding La Nina-esque, and then what we see as we see kind of maybe the potential for reemergence in the fall.
Those that have been longtime followers of some of my podcasts and broadcasts for a few decades here, they might recall that in the early days of my own ag website I used to do a weekly interview with Al Dutcher. Now, he was the Nebraska State Climatologist, and he's now retired. But anyway, we did that weekly podcast for, I believe, 17 years.
Wow.
And a number of times we used to talk about the Northern Atlantic Oscillation. And he had kind of alluded to the fact that, it runs on a different frequency, I guess, than what the ENSO does out there in the Pacific, the
Yeah.
La Nina and El Nino. They run on a little different cycle pattern, but he said the things that worried him would be if their cycles would happen to coincide on a
Yeah.
particular year. And it doesn't happen very often, but I just wondered, is that a thing? Do they talk about that nowadays?
Yeah, so the North Atlantic Oscillation, and then it's got kind of like a, I don't know, step brother called the Arctic Oscillation, which is a bit more centered over the Arctic. They are important for North American weather. They do have, like you mentioned, a much higher frequency, so we can go, whereas like for La Nina El Nino, if we if we go into a winter in La Nina, it's almost unheard of that we would flip to El Nino within that winter. Whereas the North Atlantic Oscillation or Arctic Oscillation can change signs, a dozen times in some cases within a winter season. So it's much higher frequency oscillation. And so because of that, what it can do is it really can influence sort of your week to week weather patterns, as opposed to the La Nina or El Nino, which is a kind of a longer time scale, more of like seasonal patterns. And so when we look at El Nino or the North Atlantic Oscillation, the Arctic Oscillation, it's really more trying to predict kind of the 1 to 3 week time scale of how those weather patterns may be affected by how those things are flipping. So yeah, we can see, but we see interactions between the North Atlantic Oscillation and ENSO, for example. Whereas if we're in a La Nina winter and we get let's say a negative Arctic oscillation, we can see the potential for cold air outbreaks in the upper Midwest that is much stronger than if we were in an El Nino with a negative Arctic oscillation. So that's just one example of how those things interact. Two important things when we think about the growing season, though. One is that all of these what we call teleconnections, basically patterns of sea surface temperatures or pressure, or something that is affecting our weather in the Midwest that is somewhere away from the U.S. So in the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Arctic, wherever it may be. Those teleconnections are usually most strongly linked with our climate in the wintertime. And that's because those teleconnections tend to influence the position and the intensity of the subpolar jet stream, and that jet stream is typically pushed way up into Canada during the summertime. So during most of the growing season, it's not as strong of a feature. The other thing about the North Atlantic Oscillation is that if you think about the way that the winds and the jet stream kind of go around the Earth, it's from west to east. And so we are upstream of the Atlantic. And so although the Atlantic does have an important influence on our climate, it's a little bit less of a magnitude than the Pacific because that's where we're kind of coming downstream from. So all of those things add up together. We're watching things like the North Atlantic Oscillation. And then there's these oscillations or teleconnections that are even on longer time scales. There's something called the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, or the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, that, we're talking about something that stays in a specific pattern for a decade or more, and that interacts with ENSO too. So all of these things are, you basically, imagine just having, like different frequencies, one really, really high frequency and one kind of medium frequency and one really long kind of, and then sometimes they can add up together to make for, let's say, a drier or a wetter or a warmer or a colder period of time. We saw that in the 1930s across the central U.S., where we had just the perfect, not the perfect, it was actually the exact opposite of the perfect, the ideal setup to make for very, very dry and warm conditions that period of time. So yeah, those are oscillations we're watching, and how they interact is something that is an important part of research when it comes to climate science, especially as it relates to things like agriculture.
A lot of people wonder about the solar maximum going on right now, maybe for the next year or so. And we get these extreme solar flares, and now we have, I guess you just call them solar holes. They're like dark spots on the sun that are throwing out different kinds of plasma energy off of the sun. And that's raised some concern that over time it's just really building up a static charge in the upper atmosphere. And they wonder if that has much impact on the development of thunderstorms and cyclones and that sort of thing. I mean, it's going to be in solar maximum for like another year yet, I believe, on that 11-year cycle.
Yeah, and I don't think I can speak well to interactions with thunderstorms and things like that of how that solar activity. We do know that when we've been in this kind of peak solar, the solar maximum, we tend to have more active space weather, like you alluded to. So the solar flares, the geomagnetic storms, the things like that. There's actually, now that we're talking Wednesday, April 16th, there's one that's supposed to affect much of North America tonight into tomorrow. Um, The biggest, like most upfront impacts come with things like messing with electrical grids because of the frequency there and things like that. Also giving us really pretty auroras fairly far south. We may get one here in central Illinois, we'll see. But yeah, as far as like the interactions with weather here in the troposphere and our atmosphere, yeah, I don't really know much about those interactions and how they can influence things like thunderstorms and things like that. It is really interesting and always a good reminder that the sun sort of controls what we're doing here. But yeah, I don't think I have a good answer for you as far as like what we should expect weather to be affected by that.
Anyway, so overall, it sounds like next couple of weeks it should be fairly warm with probably intermittent showers or thunderstorms in some areas. So it may be kind of hit and miss for a while. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, I think the big picture right now that we're getting towards the middle of the heart of that planting season is that we're going to be very wet in the near term in the southern Midwest, especially the southeast part of the Corn Belt. And that active pattern is looks like it will continue with above average precipitation for much of the mid-south into the southern Midwest. Also warmer than normal for pretty much the entire region through the mid part of May. So for those folks that didn't get too much or won't get too much rain and have workable soils with good soil temperatures, probably be some decent windows of opportunity for springfield work and planting. But in other places that have been wet and will continue to be wet, we, like you said, may be seeing some delays and some hit or miss conditions.
And the thing about where you're located, usually you can ride that average and you come out pretty well.
Not bad, not bad. The thing is, I know Central Illinois is the place to hate when it comes to agriculture because our weather and soils just seem to be perfect. But yeah, I mean, one big thing that we do have here is that more and more tiling going in the ground, so people are able to control their moisture conditions. And yeah, so far, much of at least Central Illinois has been not too wet. We haven't been too dry, so yeah, we'll probably actually this may be one of those years where we'll see more planters rolling in central Indiana and central Illinois than southern Illinois and Indiana, at least in April.
Well, Trent, I just enjoyed the heck out of talking with you today. I appreciate you taking some
Yeah.
time to visit with us. Terrific information, and hopefully we can do this again and kind of do some updates through the growing season, see how
Yeah.
things are coming along at that time, if you don't mind.
No, no, that would be great. It's been great talking with you. Thanks for having me on. And yeah, I'm always happy to come on and talk about. I mean, there's never a shortage of things to talk about when it comes to weather and climate. So I'm always happy to jump on with you.
I agree with that. All righty. Well, thank you, Trent. Trent Ford, the Illinois State Climatologist, with us today. That'll do it for this episode. For producer Brianne Jenkins, and I'm Marlin Bohling, and we'll catch you next time right here on the CommStock Channel. Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and/or options is substantial, and each investor and/or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.